Hi, and welcome to Lead with Bubba Scott. Today, we have a special bonus episode that covers current events. Our official first episode will be released next week, but we couldn't wait to get this bonus episode out to our listeners. I was originally going to interview Professor John Carey and discuss his career as a leader in academia, with the intent of releasing later this spring. But given the recent U.S. strike on Venezuela on January 3rd, I thought we would take this opportunity to pick Professor Carey's mind on the current situation in Latin America and give a quick turn release of this episode, which we recorded on January 4th. Professor John M. Carey of Dartmouth College is the interim dean of Dartmouth's Faculty of Arts and Sciences and a leading scholar on democracy, elections, representation, Latin American politics, and U.S. politics. He is also a co-founder of Brightline Watch, which monitors democratic performance, erosion, and resilience in the United States. He has consulted on the design and reform of electoral systems across the world. In this conversation, we go from leadership lessons he learned in unexpected places, like commercial salmon fishing in Alaska, to an historical overview of Venezuela's government and America's recent intervention. I am so excited to get after this more geopolitically motivated episode of Lead with Bubba Scott. Let's get it. Professor John Carey, welcome to Lead with Bubba Scott.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you on the show. Obviously, we've got a pretty good connection, both our love of New Hampshire and also my having trained and deployed with your son, Joe, over a 10-year period. So I'm a big fan of the Carey family and super excited to have you on the show.
Great. Looking forward to it.
So I talked a little bit in the introduction about your background, but a couple things I wanted to point out again. Obviously, you're leading the arts and sciences at Dartmouth College, which is tremendous. You also had a lot of experience in leadership within academia, and your focus in your academic background you've been a scholar of democracy, elections, representation, and then a lot of focus on both Latin America and American politics. So we'll definitely dive into some of that. Super excited to chat about it. One thing I wanted to point out too was one of the highlights of my last deployment was when you came on the ship and you actually gave a class to all the officers on the ship. And it was so popular that you were asked to give it multiple times, but I thought it was so cool because you came to the ship, you spoke about the different governments in the areas that we had been, and you talked about both their history as well as their current government. We talked about really the strength of their current governments and the outlook that they would have, whether they're currently a democracy or how that would look in the future. So that's a little bit of a highlight of some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. We know, as I touched upon, your academic background, your professional background, but not commented on at this point. You did spend some significant time fishing in Alaska for salmon, which, as we all know, is kind of a high stakes environment. So with all that as your backdrop, just a quick question. When you're thinking about your current work today and your leadership roles in school and some of the work you've done in your studies, which of the three areas have had the biggest impact on your outlook on leadership, whether it was your work in politics, your work in academia, or your work in commercial fishing?
It's an interesting question. So, I'll start by talking about the fishing part because chronologically that came first for me. I went to Alaska actually. First time I went was right after I got out of college, and I was looking for a way to make some money so that I could travel. I wanted a job that was not going to be indefinite, but back in those days in the 80s, a lot of people went up to Alaska to work in the seasonal salmon industry, and that's what I did. I ended up going back 4 more summers after that. A couple of years later, I went back to grad school, and it just kind of worked that summer cycle. I'd go to school in the academic year, and I'd go back up there and work for the same people. Because I loved it and I loved Alaska. And, it was a good way to make money when I was in graduate school. But I always worked with the same family business. The guy that I worked for was about my age. We had such different lives. I went the standard track. I got out of college. I got out of high school. I went to college, and then I worked on the hill for a couple of years. This guy had dropped out of high school when he was 17 years old and went to Alaska. He worked on the North Slope for a while. He worked in the commercial fishing business. But he followed a different path from me. But this guy was a super sharp guy. Unbelievably hardworking. He learned, he started as a deckhand. He learned how to hang nets. He learned how to build boats in addition to learning how to be a fisherman. By the time I met him, He was in his late 20s. He had a business. He owned his house. He owned the land on it. He built all his own boats. He built his equipment, the nets and so forth. He was running a crew that in the summer would have 10 to 12, sometimes 15 deckhands working for him. And I watched him operate. I watched the way he led that crew. And I wasn't thinking about it as leadership at the time. I wasn't thinking about myself as getting a lesson in leadership. But in retrospect, watching how he operated and it was a really complicated organization, right? You have to know a lot of things, and you're responsible for a big group of people. And I have to say that your average, guy working as a deckhand in Alaska, they might make some decisions that if you're the captain of the crew, you want to make sure that everybody's safe, that your equipment is safe, that you're getting the job done. And so his leadership skills were up there with all the other people I've met since in my lifetime. I speak about him in the past tense because unfortunately he died after I stopped working for him in an avalanche in winter conditions. It was a horrible loss, foremost for his family, of course, but for all of us who knew him. But he was such an impressive guy, and he operated simultaneously on so many fronts in terms of running that business and keeping people safe, keeping the business profitable. And it was a lot of fun to work for him. You worked hard, but he was such a sharp character. He was so funny. I learned so much from him. Anyway, I think I learned more about leadership from him than just about anyone else I've known in my life.
Yeah, that's tremendous. And it certainly touches on a major theme that we talk a lot about on this show, which is every person you meet or everyone you work with, you can learn something from them. And so it's great to see that even at a young age, that person made such an impact on you. I also really appreciate that highlighting that people have different backgrounds, people make different career choices, but it doesn't matter if you're going to, the best college in the world, or if you didn't go to college and you're working, when you're in a leadership position, we all have something to learn from each other. And I think that can definitely be a positive thing to leverage for everyone here on the show. Okay, so that is an awesome depiction of someone from whom you learned a lot about leadership. So you went on to attend Harvard University, and what did you study while you were there?
So the major technically was called social studies, which people often get a kick out of this. What were you like? Memorizing the state capitals. And I think I do know most of the state capitals, but that wasn't what we were doing. It was an interdisciplinary social sciences major. So we, had a mix of economics and a little bit of political science and, some history and, in my case, some religion and some literature. So it was a mix. It was a grab bag, but it was mostly focused in my case on Latin America. That was the part of the world I was really interested in at the time, still am. And, so that was the theme that tied it all.
Excellent. And upon graduation from school, you went and you joined the legislative staff for Senator John Kerry, which I'm sure must have created some confusion with the homophonic last name.
Yeah, we were never confused in person. Your podcast audience won't be able to figure this out, but I'm 5'7". I think Kerry's probably 6'3". But occasionally on the phone, calls would get crossed. Never to any great impact, although, there's some standard kind of Three Stooges kind of confusion on the phone in the office sometimes. Important to say, I'm not related to him. My last name is spelled differently, and it was just a coincidence.
Well, it's that must have been really an important period of your life, just in terms of learning. I mean, obviously, he's been involved in so much of our nation's politics in so many different ways, so many different roles. Are there things that stand out about your time there, whether it was the work you were doing or whether it was interactions that you had with him that made an impact on you before you ended up leaving?
Well, I don't want to talk trash about anyone, but I'll say this. Yeah, so the years I was working for him, in late 1980s, it was the second Reagan administration. Harry was the chair of a subcommittee on the Foreign Relations Committee that was investigating connections between the Contras in Nicaragua, whom the Reagan administration was funding, and drug deals. We didn't call them cartels then. And Kerry, he's a very smart guy. He really is. He's an impressive guy. I could do research for 2 weeks on a subject, ahead of a set of hearings, and then brief him for 15 minutes, and he would walk in and he would ask better questions than I ever could have. He was a really sharp guy, really smart on public policy. He had been a prosecutor before he went into politics. So it's just really impressive in a lot of ways. But he he didn't interact much with his staff. Bill Clinton came along a few years later, and everyone I remember saying about Clinton was you could go to an event with 500 people in a room, and every one of them would walk out of that room feeling like Clinton came to see them. And with Carey, I worked for him for a year. I was a low-level staffer. I walked out of there after a year. I'm not sure he knew me. I was working in his office every day. He just did not have that ability to connect with people, that warmth, and that takes a certain amount of effort too, right? I mean, Clinton had that ability because he worked really hard at it. And Kerry was working on other things, but I think it cost him dearly politically because in 2004, when he was the Democratic nominee, that election was his to win. There was already a lot of disillusionment with the Iraq war, and he didn't lose by much. And I think if he had ability to connect with people and really make people believe that he cared about what they had to say and was locked in on them, if he had half of Bill Clinton's talent in that particular leadership category, I think he would have been president. And I think he would have been a fantastic president. I go back to, and I know it's not a very nice thing to say about his ability to connect to people, but I think he was a really smart policy leader. I believe in a lot of the things that he stood for, but he didn't have the ability to connect with people. And that's a key part of leadership too.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that is such an interesting insight. Obviously, he was so incredibly successful in a lot of different roles, but getting over the hump for someone who was obviously, I mean, we have two major political parties in our country, and he was their choice that year. It is interesting to think about the hard skills. I often think about this from an engineering context or an aviation context, and there are hard skills that people have, and you can be the best pilot or you can be the most technically savvy person and you can make great decisions under stress and all this stuff. But if you're not able to connect with your people, it will absolutely hold you back. And it also, perhaps more importantly, it will hold you back from unlocking the full capacity of your team. So that is a really interesting insight into his leadership style. So from there, you went away to get your PhD.
Yeah, I went to California. I went to University of California in San Diego, someplace I had never been before, but it was kind of an adventure. They had a good political science program, and I just decided to kind of take a jump. At the time, I was thinking, I'd been working in DC, and I looked around me, and everybody who was doing, really pretty interesting work in public policy seemed to have some advanced degree. I didn't want to go to law school. I didn't want to go to public policy school. I just, like I said, I had the opportunity to go to UC San Diego, and I decided it would be an adventure. And I thought, if it doesn't work out, I'll figure something else out. But I ended up liking political science and ended up liking, teaching and research and so forth. The thing I wasn't thinking about at all was I did not understand how the academic job market worked. And I knew I liked New England. This is where my family's from. I thought of that as home. I went into academia thinking, well, there's a lot of schools in New England. And so, I'll just move back there after. But that's not how academia works. Academia, the job market's totally nationalized. I got a job. I ended up getting a job at University of Rochester, which was great, but it wasn't anywhere near my family. And then I made another strategic decision. Of course, it's not a strategic decision. I married another political scientist. And my mentor said, oh, this is a huge mistake. How are you ever both going to get jobs? We did end up both getting jobs, but we ended up getting jobs in Missouri. I spent a lot of years bouncing around before I managed to get back to New England, and it all worked out great. My wife is also my colleague, and we ended up back in New England just like I had anticipated. But we took a circuitous route to get there.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And I have, as much as I've learned from you over the years in our conversations, I've certainly learned just as much from your wife, Professor Valdez, as well, who's incredibly brilliant. And it's so exciting that you guys are able to teach at the same school. I will say, anecdotally, I had dinner with one of my professors, and I learned a lot more about the difficulties of co-locating. His wife is at UT Austin and he's at Penn. So it's definitely a challenging situation, but I'm hopeful that they can find the same situation that you've landed yourself in at Dartmouth.
We got very lucky. We won the lottery. So grateful for that.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about your path to Dartmouth ultimately, but you did a lot of work with John Carey. You worked your way through your PhD. You ended up getting to teach for a while. And then interestingly, you went from being strictly professor to the chair of the Department of Government for a 6-year period. was that your first professional leadership role within the faculty?
Yeah, that was the first meaningful one. And I'll make this observation about academia versus that. Your background is military, and I had the chance. I was very fortunate last year to be able to spend 10 days on the ship with you and your team, and kind of watch you guys in operation. After all these decades I've spent in academia, it was just astounding to watch hierarchy that actually recognizes that it is a hierarchy and kind of operates accordingly. Because you guys, you look on anyone's shoulder, you know where they stand, and communications, operate up and down this chain. And of course, this boat that we were on was a massive operation with thousands of people on it, and it was really fascinating to me because I have been, my leadership roles have also been in a large organization, and there's a certain amount of hierarchy in academia. But one thing about academia is it pretends that there is no hierarchy, and we go to great lengths to act as though you know it's a completely flat organization. I'm not going to say it's analogous in the military at all, but I mean it isn't a flat organization. But you have to, if you want to try to get anything done in academia, the path to doing that is very different from the path to getting something done in an organization where you've spent most of your professional life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you framed it that way, because that certainly has to do with some of the questions that I'm interested in. So one of the beauties of more strict hierarchy in that sense is that even if there are people of equal capacity or equal intellect or equal decision making skills, everyone has his or her own explicitly laid out role. And so the leader's job at that point is to get everyone to focus on his or her specific job and then orchestrate things. And if everybody focuses on their job, you're going to be able to crush it. And people have those very strictly laid out roles. So while there certainly can be relationship conflict or hierarchy conflict where people might want to step out of their lane or what have you, it is against the norm and it's against the very strictly laid out rules. Whereas it totally makes sense that there's this perception or this desire that things be flat that within academia. So my question has to do with that pretty specifically. When a Marine officer is tasking his squad leaders with something, and then the squad leader turns and tasks his fire team leaders with something, those people are going to execute it. And when the leader asks for input, they'll give it. But the way that works is when you build trust, you build the trust within a team that allows people to execute without question. And of course, there's exceptions to that in a ton of different ways, but that's a way that can work. In your role as a leader among the faculty has so many incredibly gifted intellectual and critical thinkers whose job it is to question and pull and learn and grow in that way. How do you manage decision making amongst a group of people who are so predisposed to questioning and thinking and asking?
Yeah, I think I've never learned the trick of how to manage that. So I mean, I will say this: the point you made about trust is completely essential. There's no such thing as giving a set of orders in academia. You really need to spend a ton of time, sort of building a consensus around some kind of a plan. If it's going to be a change, there's a status quo bias, I think, in that kind of organization, because it's a lot easier to lock a action than it is to take it. But if you want to get anything done, you have to spend a huge amount of time on the ground, trying your best to anticipate all the possible objections and talk to the people who are going to hold those objections. You're never going to be able to bring everyone along in the same direction necessarily. You have to build an overwhelming critical mass, and that's a lesson. I hope I've learned it. I definitely learned it through failure in some instances where I didn't put in the legwork and sort of didn't anticipate who all might object and why. To some extent, academia works like a democracy. There's things we vote on, and you need to have more people behind you than opposed. There's almost no environment where you can kind of give a set of directives and expect that people are going to follow.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I'm just curious, and perhaps I should have asked this before, but can you walk through what your role as the dean of faculty is, and what are some of the things that you're covering with? Because obviously you're still conducting research, you're still teaching, and everyone has their primary roles in that regard. But what is your role leading the faculty there?
Yeah. So now we jump from So I'm the interim dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Dartmouth. We were talking about being a department chair before. As the dean, there are 41 different academic units in the arts and sciences at Dartmouth. So you like my home department is a government department. You can imagine there's economics and history and anthropology. Those are all the social sciences, but there's also chemistry and physics and biology and mathematics and computer science in the sciences. And then, of course, there's the arts and humanities, which are, the English, French, and Spanish and Italian and so forth, but also philosophy and music. And then we've got a bunch of interdisciplinary departments as well. So there's just a huge number of units that make up the college. And my job is, first of all, recruitment and retention of faculty. So, it's the hiring and try to get the good people to stay and want to stay at Dartmouth. It's also the annual review of all the faculty members. Critically, in academic career, there are these critical moments. The tenure decision is probably the one that people are most familiar with. And so the dean of faculty oversees all of those reviews and decisions to promote, or has decisions to make about resources allocated across the different departments and academic units and across individual faculty, research support, also responsible for overseeing the curriculum. So there's a lot of things, and I don't do any of this stuff just by myself. There's 4 associate deans that are in charge of their divisions, so the social sciences and the sciences and arts and humanities and the interdisciplinary. Great team of folks who are closer to where the rubber hits the road. But that's the job, is basically looking out for the well-being of the faculty and the effectiveness of the faculty, and producing scholarship and research, and also in delivering a curriculum that our undergraduate students need.
Yeah, thank you so much for breaking that down. And you were the associate dean of your division, correct?
Yeah, I was the associate dean of social sciences for 5 years, in between being the department chair and doing what I'm doing now.
Is that kind of a standard pathway to help the faculty members grow and get more experience before they end up taking over the whole thing?
Yeah. So, if we think back to when we started off talking about the skipper of my fishing crew, whom I admired so much, and one critical thing about him is he knew everybody's job better than they did. He could do everyone's job. I'm not in that position, but having been associate dean was really valuable for me to know what that job is like on the ground, and have a sense of what that part of my team is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, thinking back on your comment about flat versus hierarchical organizations, comparing an academic institution with the military, it's actually pretty interesting because it is very similar. That progress, that growth is very similar. You're not going to get a division of Marines until you've spent on the officer. You need to do the division before you can be a department head. And then before you take command, you need to be the department head. So that is really interesting how, while obviously very different organizations, there's still that idea of increasing responsibility, the growth that comes from that experience before you step in, so that you're set up for success when you ultimately take the reins of the whole faculty.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, so I'd like to shift gears a little bit here to talk a little bit more about your research and some of your instruction. And so, like I mentioned at the beginning, when you came on the ship, you spoke to us about the different governments of countries that we had been near or visited. I would like to learn a little bit more about your research on representation, elections, and then in particular democratic resilience. And what does that really entail?
Now I'll go back in time to when I started out in academia, when I went to graduate school. I was interested. I'd been working when I was on the Hill on mainly U.S. foreign policy toward Central America and Latin America. And in that era, this is the late 1990s at that point, and that region, Latin American region, was in the middle of a transition away from, but for the past 20, 25 years in most countries had been military dictatorships. By the early 90s, democracy almost throughout the whole region. And I was really interested in whether or not those democracies could survive. What were the conditions that would help them to survive? And I got involved when I was still in graduate school in some debates about whether or not you could basically make democracy more resilient by fixing the rules of the game, literally what's written down in the Constitution and in the electoral laws. There's no way that's going to fix every problem. You can't just, I think we learned the hard way, Afghanistan over the years, that you can't just write a new constitution and expect democracy to take root. But I do think there are some things you can do better and worse in the way we write down the formal rules. And so I spent a lot of my early part of my career immersed in that in those scholarly debates, um, and got very interested in the way elections are held and the way representation works. And then ended up, because I had studied this stuff and written about it and published some stuff on it, ended up having opportunities to serve sometimes as a consultant to foreign governments when they were thinking about rewriting their own constitution or their own electoral rules. And it's always been, sort of motivated by this original question, which is like, can we, if we get this a little bit less wrong, I'll say that instead of right. If we get it a little bit less wrong, and can that help countries avoid what had happened in the Latin American region in the sort of 60s and 70s, which was the breakdown of a lot of countries that had been democratic for a while before that, and that slipped backward into military dictatorships. And so that's been the overall project. Sometimes with I think more success, and sometimes with less.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and just listing some of the places that you've done some of that consultation. We've got Canada, Nepal, Afghanistan, Jordan, Tunisia, Yemen, South Sudan, Israel, Mexico, Bolivia, El Salvador, and the Philippines. So this is pretty incredible that you were able to take your area of academic study and leverage that to help these different countries as they either sought to make their democracy more resilient or just looking at how they're going to change their government. So if you're thinking about some of those experiences, are there any that stand out to you as either particularly challenging or as a place where you felt like you were able to make the biggest impact?
Yeah, so you'll note, any of your listeners will note, that wasn't an unmitigated parade of democratic successes on that
Right.
list. So, one thing I learned, if you think about what that job consisted of, it was different in each instance, but the thing that tied it together was, countries that are thinking about reforming or creating a bunch of representative institutions. And my role would generally be to come in and provide them a menu of options and say, look, there's a whole lot of different ways you can elect your legislature. And here's how it's done in Brazil, and here's how it's done in Canada, and here's how it's done in India, and here's Germany, and so forth. And there's pluses and minuses of each of those, and I would try to spell those out. Ultimately, it's the local politicians who are going to make the decision. One thing that I've found is I've kind of taken that message around to different audiences around the world. Is like, the politicians are incredibly acute students of how the rules are either going to affect their own political self-interest. I mean, they're so sharp. They very quickly get to a level of sophistication of understanding the rules that most political scientists never achieve, because they're mapping it straight back onto, okay, if we do this, how's this going to affect my prospects in the next election? And they're only ever going to embrace a reform that, at the very least doesn't hurt their prospects. And of course, they're looking for is advantage. So, you might go in there as a scholar and have this platonic ideal of the way elections should work, but that's not going to get any traction at all unless the people who hold the balance of power in that situation see an advantage in it. But a lot of
Yeah.
those cases that I went into are places where I did not know a whole lot about the background politics, which I think was probably a good thing, in the sense I did not know who were the likely winners or losers of any of the options that I laid out, which I think is a good thing, because if I had known, I would have been tempted inevitably to try to shape outcomes according to my own design, and that's not why I was asked to be there, and wouldn't probably have been appropriate anyway. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to take away from that. One thing that came into my mind when you were talking about how rapidly the local politicians are able to pick up the rules and see how they can either be leveraged, for or against, like, for them or against their opponents. It made me really think about how remarkable it is that in the United States at the time of the revolution, we ended up coming away with what we have. Because there were, of course, as we all know, opportunities for people at the time to take larger swaths of power. I'm thinking predominantly of George Washington. Imagining how fortunate we are that one person who could have been endowed with so much power said, that's not what we're trying to do here. I think it takes like almost a Herculean level of discipline to make something like that happen, and to see that reflected in these areas where you've tried to work. I mean, it seems like that would be human nature. The natural thing to do would be to look at how you can leverage this thing to your favor. So are there things that you because you mentioned how you bring a menu, you show people different ways of approaching the problem set. A layman like myself would be like, here's a menu, it's called the United States Constitution.
It's interesting. I mean, the U.S. has played the role of a nation builder more than once, sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully. Obviously, the cases that a lot of people look back to and think of as successes would be after World War II, occupying Japan and playing a role in the reconstruction of Germany. But what's really interesting is that neither one of those countries adopted, even though MacArthur was on the ground for the drafting of the Japanese constitution, but their constitution looked very different from ours. It's not a presidential system, in the way. So that fundamental division of powers doesn't exist there, and the way they elect their diet, their legislature is very different. Similarly, in Germany had a lot, sort of a longer democratic history prior to the war than Japan. But again, it went back to a system that doesn't look very much at all like the United States. So, and then, in Afghanistan and Iraq, where the U.S. was much more, sort of on the ground and directing to construct democratic institutions there, neither country ended up with a system that looked exactly like the United States, and they actually didn't look very much like each other either. So the U.S., when it's played this role, has often made moves. They have not just handed over a photocopy of the U.S. Constitution with the idea that that's what's going to be appropriate. And the Afghanistan experience, of course, was a disaster. Iraq, it was hard going for the first 10 years, certainly, but their democracy was doing a little bit better now, but it doesn't look anything like the U.S. Constitution on paper or in practice. One of the key things is that, the institutions that are going to work out in any given place are going to be particular to the histories, demographics, the willingness of the actors on the ground to engage. And really what they need to be willing to engage in is, the key thing that any democracy needs is people need to be willing to lose, right? They need to be willing to lose, and even when they lose, be willing to continue to play the same game and come back in 4 years or 5 years or whatever the time period is and take another shot at it. And if they're not willing to do that, no democracy is going to get traction. And if they are, you got a shot. And the variety of different configurations that you can have is pretty diverse. And if you look at the successful democracies around the world, no two of them look the same. And they really are. It's a huge amount of variety. I remember being very surprised by this when I started to study political science. I had no idea. I assumed, I come from the oldest democracy and that's the way democracy looks. And I got looking around and realized, no, not at all. It looks wildly different in all different environments.
Yeah, wow, that is a really, I think, helpful and powerful insight. The idea that, there are a lot of ways to do it. No way necessarily is the right way, as you said, the least wrong. And then that key ingredient that the people who are running for office have to be willing to accept defeat for a democracy to be successful. And that certainly stands out as something that's been in the headlines for the past even 5 to 10 years, but certainly more recently. So as everybody is well aware, the U.S. had a strike on Venezuela wherein we captured their de facto leader, Nicolas Maduro. And I'd just be really interested in your perspective, having studied not only democracy and political science for so long, but with your more of a focus on Latin America. Can you give us a little bit of a backdrop of why is Venezuela such an important country to Latin America? It seems like there are a lot of players involved in Venezuela that people aren't thinking of every day, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, the United States. Why it's such an important...
Cuba.
Right.
Maybe most important of all.
Yeah. So I'm sure there's no shortage of the things I don't know about Venezuela in terms of the role that it plays in Latin America. I'd be very interested if you could give us a backdrop on why it's such an important country.
Sure. I'll give you, again, there's the danger of asking a social scientist any question. I gotta go back 40 years. But I will say this. Again, when I was starting to study Latin American politics back in the 1980s, the region had been, from the 60s into the 80s, mostly military dictatorships. There were very few democracies. And Venezuela was the exception. Venezuela was always held out as an island of democracy in a sea of dictatorships because it had been. So it was You go back even further, it had had its share of dictatorships, including military dictatorships. But starting in 1958, they democratized and they created a system that was it was deeply imperfect, and it was there was a lot of corruption and so forth, largely related to the oil wealth that the country has. But they had a democracy with competitive parties, where again, what I mentioned before, the critical thing was the losers were willing to cede power, and they had from 1958 all the way up until the early 2000s, they had a democracy where you had losers consent, and you had these regular turnover of power and a reasonably free press and media that was critical of government, and people who were critical and didn't worry about being abducted and imprisoned and so forth. So there was a lot wrong with Venezuelan democracy in that period, but relative to the region they were in, they were a case study of success. And things changed gradually, really. The 1990s was a tough decade for Venezuela economically. It was brutally tough economically. Oil prices were low, and the economy was very oil dependent. As I said, there was a lot of corruption. So when the government coffers ran dry, the social programs dried up, and it was really hard times. And Hugo Chavez kind of made his name at that time, and he was elected president. I guess it was in 1998. He was elected, became president in 1999, and he was wildly popular at first. And he won successive elections. He called for a new constitution, and that was popular, and that was ratified. And he built a party, and they were winning elections. He was winning clean elections for the first more or less decade of his presidency. But he was also dismantling the independent courts, the independent electoral authorities, the independent legislature, and he was really setting the groundwork for dictatorship, which I would say the second half of his presidential term, I would say Venezuela was no longer a democracy. And then he died in 2013, and Nicolas Maduro took over as his handpicked successor. Venezuela hasn't even had the pretense of democracy in the years since. The most blatant example would have been 2024, actually. I was going to say last year, but a year and a half ago, when Venezuela had a presidential election, and Maduro had stacked all the odds. He had the state-run media on his side. He struck down the ability of his main opponent to even be on the presidential ticket. He controlled the electoral count, and yet the opposition still beat him. And they documented that they beat him through an incredible grassroots effort on the ground to demonstrate polling station by polling station that they had won. In the past, when he had stolen elections, he had a rigged count, and he presented a count. At least he presented numbers that may have been fictitious, but he presented them. This time he didn't even bother. He just declared himself the winner and went on governing. So, Venezuela is clearly a dictatorship under Maduro. And so what we saw, I guess it's really only 36 hours ago, was his removal by a U.S. military intervention. And so I want to make sure and remind your viewers, whatever else we say about Venezuela, that this first day and a half since the intervention has been just head spinning in terms of the news that's come out of the country. And I'm sure the next days and weeks are going to continue to be. And so we'll be wrong about almost anything we say. I'll try to be as less wrong as I can. But the situation is pretty fluid right now. And it's been mystifying to me to see. There was originally that the intervention and the extraction of Maduro was lawless, as far as I could tell, by the U.S. military. Didn't lose anyone, didn't lose any equipment. They took Maduro out of the country without harming him or his wife, who was also, taken. But I have no idea what the administration's plan is going forward. I watched the press conference. I'm sure you probably did too yesterday. I watched that extraction, and I thought, well, it doesn't look like this is intended to be an occupation. And yet the administration has said, no, we're going to run the place. And I don't know how that's going to work. So we're at a moment of real uncertainty now.
Yeah, it's definitely a wild 36 hours. Thank you so much for giving us the backdrop in terms of just where Venezuela was to where it is today. A really interesting thing, just I've been looking at a lot of this stuff on social media, and of course it's like split almost right down the middle, with a lot of people saying, reinstate Maduro. The will of the Venezuelan people needs to be what dictates what happens in Venezuela. Then you see a lot of Venezuelan immigrants in the United States basically saying we didn't want him to be in charge. So, and as you kind of laid out, he was not fairly elected. Of course, it would have been ideal that the Venezuelan people would have been able to affect that change themselves. But for better or for worse, he is no longer in the country. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. So obviously, we can't say exactly what the perfect path would be, but can you talk about U.S. Handover of the keys back to the country? How could that play out successfully?
You talk about handover of the keys, and that's an interesting metaphor because it suggests that we have the keys or have had them at some point, and that's the thing that was so uh, mystifying to me was this was an incredibly targeted extraction, but there aren't any boots on the ground there anymore. The Maduro regime was a lot more than Maduro, and so you start to see in the news now some of the names that people like me who are Latin American politics have been paying attention to for a while, and now they're starting to become, household words, or they will become household names probably in American news media. And the military, Vladimir Petrino, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, Diosdado Cabello, who's the Interior Minister, got Tarek William Saab, who is the Attorney General. These are some of the heavy hitters in the they've been at the top of the Maduro regime, and some of them going back even to the Chavez years. And then if you go further down, and a bunch of names that I don't know, but kind of their roles I know. There's if you think about the Venezuelan military, I think I got this right. You should refer you to the work of a political scientist named Javier Corrales, who's just probably the best expert on Chavismo and the Chavez regime, Maduro regime in Venezuela. He just said the Venezuelan military. I think this is right, that the Venezuelan military is about the same size now that it was 25 years ago when Chavez became president, but it's got about 12 to 15 times as many generals as it had then. You think about that. Why so many generals? The main answer, I think, is that promoting people who are willing to support the regime was a way to pay them off. When being a general doesn't necessarily mean in the Venezuelan military that you've got a lot of leadership capacity in terms of military skills, but each one of these people is basically the patron of his own corruption network, whether it's drug trafficking, illegal mining, human trafficking, the various illegal activities that the Venezuelan military and this regime have been involved in. And so there's this extensive network throughout the whole of this regime of people for whom, moving to a democracy poses a huge threat. Any change in the status quo is going to threaten their livelihoods and maybe even their legal status and their ability to live and not be arrested and convicted. So there's a lot of people below the level of Maduro who are, I think, terrified right now about what the political future might hold in Venezuela. A lot of them are heavily armed, and they've got good reasons not to want to transition to democracy. So that's the big challenge. It would be hard enough to say, we're going to run the country for a while and then hand over the keys if the U.S. military were there. And I'm not endorsing that at all, I think. But without the military there, without our military there, without any occupation, and with all that, sort of the nuts and bolts of the Maduro regime still in place, I have no idea what the plan is for, like I said, that Trump said we're going to run the country, we're going to run the place. I don't know what that means. And of course, the new president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, who is Maduro's vice president, now she's been sworn in as president, she doesn't seem to think that the U.S. is going to run the place either, not from her initial statements. So it's just a head scratcher for me.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. That is a much more nuanced and precise depiction of a question that I've always been kind of concerned with when it comes to any toppling of a military dictatorship or any country that has been run by their military, where you've got folks who are doing illegal things, to put it lightly. When you have the transition, what happens to all those guys who were that level below, who were being told what to do, but they were doing it? And so that's where I think, and this is just my take, and I'm by no means qualified to necessarily make this statement, especially not to you, but I think a huge part of the success of our democracy today is the commitment of the American military to the Constitution. And that idea, I mean, obviously, it's one thing to say it. It is important that we say it's important that people swear an oath to the Constitution, not necessarily to the president. Of course, you've got, you have to follow orders of those people, but you do not swear an oath to an individual person. And I think about that a lot when I think about the different nations that have struggled with that in the past. So it's a very, I think that's a hugely important part of our country. It's a little bit tangential to what you were talking about, but I think it certainly helps keep our ranks clean when we have a transition of power.
It's not tangential at all. I think it's actually the key point. And I don't know what the oath is that the Venezuelan generals swear. They may have sworn an oath to the Venezuelan constitution, but their loyalty is to the regime. And a lot of them are in a position where if this regime falls, they're certainly and freedom and maybe their lives are at threat. And so that's a huge challenge. It's interesting. Here's the most charitable interpretation I can give to what I saw in the president's press conference yesterday. If we think back 20 years or so, I guess, to the Iraq invasion, and one of the in retrospect, one of the mistakes that a lot of people say was made there was this attempt at de-Baathification, right? So they had a regime, similar in some ways, a military-backed regime that had been in power for decades in Iraq, and the decision was made under the U.S. occupation to really clean house completely and to remove all these Ba'ath Party members who'd been, loyal to Saddam Hussein from their public office and from the Iraqi military. But of course, so many of them ended up as part of the insurgency, which was, much tougher and longer lasting than I think had been anticipated when the U.S. originally went in. So there was a sense that while this effort at de-Baathification was a mistake, and that the occupation and reconstruction of Iraq would have been smoother and more successful had they left in place a lot of the lower ranking people and tried to kind of bring them around to loyalty to the new regime. So I guess the most charitable possible interpretation I could give of what, President Trump meant or means by saying, we're going to work with the existing government is that they're trying to avoid that mistake from Iraq. But, so often we kind of learn the mistakes of the last war and then overcorrect. And I've been watching the Chavez and then the Maduro regime for long enough that it's hard for me to imagine any successful establishment of the rule of law, much less democracy, if you leave in place that military and that cast of characters, because I don't think they're committed to the rule of law or much less democracy.
Right. I mean, that is such an important comparison as well. And I wonder, I think it's such an interesting problem, and this gets to one of the major questions I wanted to talk about. But when you make comparisons between what the U.S. intervention in Venezuela a couple of days ago, and you look at U.S. intervention in other nations, one of the major differences, I mean, just from a fundamental perspective, is like Venezuela is right there. Like we're not so far from Venezuela, whereas Iraq, Afghanistan, we're very far away from. There would never have been the opportunity in those scenarios if you wanted to topple a regime to do a quick, what was effectively a highly orchestrated raid, a snatch and grab out of the country. So it is I'm sure there are tons of similarities, and there are probably some really important things that are different about the scenarios. I'd be interested in your perspective on that comparison. And then also, I do want to kind of look at, there were offensive weapons used. There was effectively a raid conducted. The administration is talking about this as a law enforcement operation. I'm very interested in the legality of the president's order to conduct that strike.
Yeah, I won't pretend to, have expertise in international law, but just reading the sources that I read, I don't think there's, I don't think there's any case for the legality of that. And of course, we've been debating for the past few months the kinetic, sort of attacks on Venezuelan boats that preceded this. There's all kind of under the same legal claims that, um, there's drugs being trafficked and that those constitute a national security threat that warrant, military intervention. And, I just I don't buy that. In support of international drug trafficking, we've got legal mechanisms for arresting and investigating and trying people who are involved in those activities, and it doesn't involve just executing them and destroying all the evidence. So much less sending the military in to do an arrest. That looks more like an invasion to me. And I don't, as far as I know, U.S. law enforcement doesn't have jurisdiction in Caracas. None of this is meant to be an apology for Maduro or a defense of Maduro or of his regime. But in terms of law, my understanding is that this is just, you know, uh, making it up as you go along on a lot of levels. And that's not how the law works. The law works according to precedent and, commonly recognized understandings. And that's what the rule of law is. I don't think this falls within the rule of law. So I got that off my chest, even though, like I said, I'm not a legal scholar.
Well, no, I certainly appreciate your perspective, and that's takeaways I have from this are things that I'm really interested in. My first concern is that they are successful going forward, and the will of the people occurs, and they are able to just function better, and their people have more say in their government going forward. But then, two, I'm very interested in what the legal fallout and legal defense is of the administration. Just from the idea of conducting a strike. Every time the U.S. does this, President Obama did it, President Biden did it, President Trump did it. He's done it again. We have these presidents who conduct these strikes and then, like you said, either making it up as we go along or asking for forgiveness, not for permission, because we're supposed to have a war declared by Congress. Who's to say what a war declaration really is if we go in and strike and take your not the legitimate president but the de facto leader of the country? Is that a declaration of war?
A declaration of war, as it's written in the Constitution with a declaration by Congress, it's an artifact of history. Of course, we didn't have it in Korea. We didn't have it in Vietnam. We haven't had it in any of the conflicts since. Um, if we go back, to think about the sort of post-Vietnam era, so now we're within late 60s, early 70s. We're within 25, 30 years of the end of World War II. The experiences in Korea and the experiences in Vietnam had already shown Congress that, there's something anachronistic about the idea of international declarations of war. The conflicts we're involved in now don't look anymore, and this is during the height of the Cold War, they don't look anymore like, the kind of mid 20th century conflicts where big national armies are rolling across the field, And so there was an effort to sort of to write legislation to, sort of outline what's going to happen when the president feels like they need to use military force. How are we going to maintain some kind of a check on that power by the legislature? We had a bill, the War Powers Resolution, that was in place. So now we're talking about these to the 90s. People used to talk about this a lot. And basically, it carved out for the president some authority to use unilaterally and take the initiative in use of military force, but it set up a timetable under which Congress was supposed to approve what had happened in a relatively short period of time. And if the president's actions didn't meet approval, the president was supposed to withdraw and retract. And that proved unworkable completely. Again, thinking about the Cold War era, the actions we had were often sort of one-off kind of things. Think about Grenada, eventually think about the invasion of Panama in 1989. Some of the other actions that took place around the world, the War Powers Act was unworkable. Then we had, after the 9/11 attacks, the authorization for the use of military force that governed most of what we call the war on terror, or ostensibly governed it. But that too, it was initially a pretty broad concession of authority from Congress to the executive branch to be able to use the military. But they never envisioned how broad it was going to be when it got it, as it was interpreted as the years went by and eventually as the decades went by. And, the war we called the war on terror changed from these sort of invasions and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan into a much more kind of drone-centric, one-off strike-centric use of force. So as the decades go by, we keep trying to legislate the wars we fought previously and that we recognize from our recent history, but the technology keeps changing. The nature of adversaries keeps changing, and it just seems like I don't know whether and how it'll ever be possible to reestablish a legal framework that can effectively constrain executive discretion, because the executive ultimately is concentrated. Madison and Hamilton recognized this when they wrote the Federalist Papers, even though they couldn't possibly have envisioned the technological changes, the geopolitical changes that would come in the next 250 years. But they understood one thing, which was critical, which was the executive has the energy and it has the ability to make decisions and act on them quickly, and the legislature never will. Legislatures are slow and cumbersome, and they operate on consensus. And international conflict seems to be moving one step ahead of the ability of our Congress ever to catch up with it. So I'm not sure what we're ever going to see in terms of, sort of declarations of war or control over the war-making authority that resembles what's written down on the pages of our Constitution.
I think it's really interesting. Of course, representatives from both parties have made statements about Congress's decision. You've had Republicans who are supporting the decision. And of course, across the whole spectrum, people who've deplored it. I will say, as an American who votes and who cares about our democracy, I tend to feel that Congress wants to castigate the president for doing things, but it's Congress's job to do things, as opposed to Congress in this unceasing stalemate where they just abuse the president of both parties, whether it was President Biden or currently President Trump. So that's my soapbox from an unqualified business school student.
Just do your job.
Yeah, do your job. I do my job. I want you to do your job. Okay, so I've taken up quite a bit of your time. I've got just one more question for you that I ask everyone who comes on the show. But if you had one leadership trait that you would recommend to a young aspiring leader, someone who wants to make an impact out there, what would you recommend that they work on?
Listening skills. That's the key thing, I think, is understanding what the people in your organization are trying to achieve. If you can hear them, and I say this not as someone who thinks I've mastered this, but as someone who recognizes the most important thing for me to work on too, which is that you have to understand what the folks around you. Everybody's motivated by something. Everybody's got a set of goals that they're seeking. You're going to be successful as a leader to the extent that you can figure out how each individual's motivations can advance the organization and how to harness those so that they can work together. And the key thing, again, that my problem is that I've got my ideas about where I want to go, and I'm in a hurry to get there. And I know that I'll be more successful in getting there if I can take a breath, slow down, listen really carefully to what people are telling me, and figure out what's possible based on what their aspirations are. That's what I would point to, and that's also where I'm going to be working as my New Year's resolution for 2026.
That's fantastic. And I completely agree. And it's something on which I can work quite a bit and grow quite a bit as well. And I think some of the politicians in our government and governments around the world could do a better job of listening as well. So, Professor Carey, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was really awesome. We ran a wide gambit here from talking about leadership to talking about American intervention in Latin America. So thanks for your patience as we navigated that. And thanks so much for coming on the show.
It was a lot of fun. Good to see you, Bubba.
Good to see you. Thanks so much for listening to Lead with Bubba Scott. This episode was recorded and edited with Riverside.fm. Theme music developed with Suno AI. If you enjoyed the show, please follow and leave a review wherever you find your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on Instagram @LeadWithBubba and let us know your thoughts in the comments. See you next time.